Come on in. And there may be just a tad bit of overlap between where Andy left off and where I'm going to pick up. So I apologize for the overlap, but we'll just call it review. How's that? Probably a good thing to think about it that way. This is an ancient harbor at Troas. You can still see some of the piers or some of the structures there in the water. Be an interesting place to visit because a lot happened in Troas. And we'll be talking about that today. This is a street. This was an east-west street that ran from the harbor to the marketplace. Y'all remember what the marketplace was called in the New Testament? The Agora, right, the Agora. So you read about Jesus going to the marketplace or visiting people in the marketplace. Marketplace was kind of a gathering location in every city for conversations, for purchasing things, for meetings. All kinds of things happen in the Agora. So this was a major east-west street from the harbor to the Agora. And I thought I would show you a little bit. So we learned that Paul was in Greece. He went through Macedonia and Philippi. And we're going to pick it up right about here in our text. You can kind of see where they're going. So here's Troas on this side of the Aegean, and then he'll be traveling along through here as we go through the text. Okay, let's look at the first 6 verses of chapter 20. And I'll stop for a momentary pop quiz. We got to have a pop quiz, right? So after the uproar ceased, what uproar? The riot in Ephesus. Where was everybody gathered? Do you remember? In Ephesus, they all rushed into the theater. Yeah, this big giant theater that back then seated thousands. It seats even more today. My understanding is that they still hold plays there, which would be like the coolest thing ever to attend a play at the theater in Ephesus, wouldn't it? The big amphitheater that they have built there, very large. So there was a big stink. You'll remember that one of the city officials comes out and says, listen, we got courts. You got a problem, take it up in the courts. We're going to get charged with rioting. Go home. It's kind of what he told the crowd. So everybody left. So chapter 20 starts in Ephesus. Okay. After the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through those regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, and he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater the Berean, son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians Aristarchus and Secundus, and Gaius of Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians Tychicus and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Okay, interesting passage. A lot of details in this narrative. So where did Paul go after leaving Ephesus? Went to Macedonia. And what did he do in Macedonia? Verse 2. Just encouraged the disciples. The churches kind of went back and said, hey, hang tough, be strong, keep studying, keep growing. Encourage them. And then where did he go after there in verse 2? He went to Greece. So he went south to Greece. And then it says that he had planned to go someplace, but decided not to. So where had he planned to go? There in verse 3.
Syria.
Wanted to go to Syria. Sailed across what? The southern part of the Aegean and the northern part of the Mediterranean Sea to get to Syria, which is north of what we would call the Holy Land, that whole area. You remember he left a lot of times from Antioch there in Syria. So he's about to set sail for Syria. Did he go there? Why didn't he go there? Yeah, there was a plot. And actually, it's interesting to look at, I was looking at 1 Corinthians 11. We're not going to jump over there, but if you want to just make a mental note, Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 11 all the stuff that he went through, including threats from his own people. And the Jews, he was a Jew, the Jews were plotting against him. So he decided not to go to Syria. He decided to go where? Go back through Macedonia there at the end of verse 3. And then there's this whole big long list of names. Sopater, Aristarchus, Secundus, Gaius, Timothy, Tychicus, and Trophimus. Any of those ring a bell? Some of them should. Timothy for sure. Yeah, Timothy for sure should ring a bell. Any of the rest of them? I'm sorry? Gaius? Yeah. He's mentioned in other letters. Tychicus, if you'll remember, Tychicus was sent by Paul on several occasions to not only take Paul's letter to whatever church he was writing to, but a lot of times to encourage them. So you'll see Tychicus mentioned in several of Paul's letters.
Aristarchus has been traveling with him for a while.
Aristarchus is another name that should ring a bell. Very good. Yeah, he's been traveling with him. So he's got a pretty good crew of really reliable people that he knows he can trust and that are helping him along the way. What were the days of unleavened bread? Passover, okay. Why unleavened bread? Anybody remember the connection there? And the Passover story, what is, you remember? So there wasn't time to let the bread rise, right? God said, I'm going to take you out of Israel. I'm going to take you out of captivity in Egypt. I'm going to take you out of here, and it's going to happen so fast, you're not going to be able to let the bread rise. I mean, it's going to happen that fast. And so they were to eat unleavened bread as a reminder of how fast God was going to act. And it was the very next day, wasn't it? Passover occurred, firstborn of all Egypt died that night, the Passover night. Those that had blood, the lamb's blood on the lintels of the door, were passed over. All kinds of great symbolism back to Jesus and what Jesus means for us in the New Testament. He's actually described as our Passover lamb, so that we don't have to die. And it's again his blood. It's one of the connections that we find to the Lord's Supper in the New Testament. But the unleavened bread was representative of the fact that God was acting imminently and quickly. And so they took unleavened bread. It's one of the things that we do today, because in the Passover meal that Jesus celebrated with his disciples, what we call the Last Supper, they shared unleavened bread there too. And as an example, we follow that same example. It's kind of a neat way to remember that God is acting imminently in our lives too, isn't it? Interesting to think back on the past week, the past month, how God has worked in your life. Think about that. It's amazing to have that perspective and understand how God works. So what was Paul's travel time to Troas? Took him 5 days to get there. How long did he stay there? 7 days. There's a lot of good detail in this, isn't there? We know how long it took him to sail that distance. It must have been an absolutely beautiful trip. We were talking before class about the places that Paul visited today would be considered a Mediterranean cruise, right? Or something like that. I mean, it was beautiful areas, and we'll look at some pictures of some of these places as we go into the narrative a little further. Now I'm sorry, yes.
One more quick thing, a man that's not mentioned but was clearly with him because he says us and we would have been Luke.
That's right, thank you.
Part of the travel party, because it kind of looks like some of those guys, well, it says they went on ahead and we sailed from Philippi, so it would have been he and Luke and
Yeah. Yeah, so Luke was with him. He's writing the narrative, and he says we. So yeah, they leave from Philippi after Passover, and in 5 days they get to Troas and meet the rest of the group. Okay. A lot of good narrative there. A lot of travel and things going on in those first 6 verses or so. Here is a video from Dr. Manner about Paul's time in Troas. We're going to watch the video and then look at the text.
At the end of Acts chapter 19, Paul leaves Ephesus and goes on into what we would call Greece, and he stays there for a while, and eventually on his way back, he is going to stop at Troas, but some of his friends have made their way to Troas before him. But these had gone on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. We sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread and came to them at Troas within 5 days, and there we stayed 7 days. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day, and he prolonged his message until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered together, and there was a young man named Eutychus sitting on the windowsill, sinking into a deep sleep. And as Paul kept on talking, he was overcome by sleep and fell down from the 3rd floor and was picked up dead. The map here shows the route that he is following, having left Greece, and he's making his way. In this portrayal, it's on the dotted line that you'll see on the map. And he's going to stop at Troas. Now, the Bible tells us that he's in a hurry to get to Jerusalem before Pentecost. But this journey begins immediately after Passover. Now, there's a limited amount of time between those two. Pentecost, of course, refers to 50 days, and in verse 6, the text tells us, we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. This is one of those phrases that is designed to accommodate not only the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but also the Passover. And so they get there in 5 days, they wait 7 days, and then in verse 16, the Bible tells us about his intent. For Paul had decided to sail past Ephesus so that he would not have to spend time in Asia, for he was hurrying to be in Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So there's a time compression that is under consideration here. Now, as he delays his stay in Troas for 7 days, this would inevitably interrupt his trip and the speed of getting to Jerusalem. Why would he do that? Clearly, the Bible tells us that he is there in part for the Christians, for the disciples in Troas. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul began talking to them, intending to leave the next day. What is so special about the first day of the week? As New Testament Christians, we gather together on the first day of the week. Why is that important? This is a topic of some dispute that goes on in the religious world today. But certainly one of the things that stands out stellar in this is it was the day that the Lord was raised from the dead. To commemorate that event, that stellar event that makes his life so distinctly different than all others. And Paul argues the power of the resurrection in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. But secondly, it's also the day on which The earthly manifestation of God's chosen people, the church, begins the pouring forth of the Holy Spirit upon the apostles on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. This is an extraordinary day in history, and it should be an extraordinary day for you and me as children of God to commemorate the day that Jesus was raised from the dead and the day that the church began so many years ago. We're a part of that group. Now, as we look at the episode, one of the things that takes place is this young man Eutychus who falls asleep. Now, the Bible tells us that he was on the third floor. Here is a photograph of a ruin of one of these types of buildings that's very common in the Roman Empire. And this one is only 2 stories tall, but these are scattered all over the Roman Empire. And it was a building similar to this, that Eutychus would have been in one of those upper stories, the third story in this case. This photograph is of a model of one of those that has multiple stories. These apartment complexes were very, very common. The bottom floor was reserved usually for businesses, and then the upper stories were where the people lived. And in a very real sense, these are apartment complexes. And it was in one of these rooms, one of these apartments, that they had gathered together, and the Bible tells us that there were many lamps in the room. Now, typically in the ancient world, people would go to bed soon after sunset because they didn't want to spend the money on burning oil in their lamps and so forth and so on, and then they would rise at sunrise. But these lamps are these kinds of things. They're not very big, and you put olive oil in it, and there would be a wick in the front. Here is a smaller one and a little bit larger one. And some of these might be bronze and sitting on a lampstand. And examples of these are shown in the photograph here. And of course, the one on the lampstand portrays the very kind of thing that Jesus talks about. One doesn't light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all that are in the house. But if you have a number of these that are being scattered around the room and the flame is there and you begin to have an oxygen depletion, plus it's late at night, it's really sort of small wonder that someone might fall asleep. And Eutychus becomes a victim of that. And Paul's concern for him to raise him from the dead, I'm sure, gave a powerful impact on the people. But the first day of the week is the day that you and I are to gather together to celebrate the Lord's death, burial, and resurrection.
Okay. Always interesting to watch that. I was looking, and if you're interested, you can go on YouTube and actually find out how to make one of these ancient lamps. Doesn't take much. They're just made out of clay. Pretty simple. You got one? You got one at home? That'd be cool. Neat. Yeah, it'd be a fun little project, wouldn't it? I did want to share this brief excerpt from an article from Easton's Bible Dictionary. The Jews reckoned the day from sunset to sunset. So it was originally divided into 3 parts. Then later it was separated into like 4 watches that we see in the New Testament. But the day started for Jews at sunset. So when did Sunday start in relation to our time for them? When did the first day of the week start from a Jew's perspective? Saturday evening, right? At sunset. So what we would call Saturday evening. When would the first day of the week end for Jews based on our time? 6 o'clock Sunday night, Sunday evening, yeah. So that was the window of what they considered the first day of the week. So when they gathered on the first day of the week in this setting, what day of the week would it be for us? It'd be Saturday evening, right? So they gather together on the first day of the week, start their day, which starts at sunset. They start their day at 6 p.m., and Paul's preaching, and they're all gathered together. probably jumping ahead here. Let me make sure I stick with it. Here's some lamps. This is a whole bunch of little lamps that they have found. These are all from that time period, so 1st century lamps. So this is what they would have looked like. And you'll notice they have little holes in the top, which would be for filling them with oil, right? They would use olive oil. The ones that you see on YouTube, people use these really nice, like kerosene lamp wicks. They didn't have wicks like that. It might have been a little piece of textile, a little bit of cloth, but it wasn't quite as robust. Yes?
It helps to understand, like the parable Jesus told about the foolish virgins and the wise ones,
Yeah.
because those size of lamp, they'll run out.
They'll run out, yeah. You got to have enough oil with you to keep it running, especially something this size that kind of fit in the palm of your hand. I did see one article that said, it's asking about how much light they put out. 4 lumens. 4 lumens. So the equivalent of a couple of candles is what they put out. If you get a really cheap, inexpensive, not worth anything, not worth the money that you buy it with, a $2 flashlight at Walmart, it might be 100 lumens. The police are going to carry, and like on an ambulance, those flashlights are going to be 1,000, 1,500, or 2,000 lumens or more. So 4 lumens, they don't put out a lot of light. So I really appreciate Dr. Manner's perspective on these lamps, and it's thus that there was a lot of lamps in there. Whether or not there was oxygen depletion, I don't know. He was sitting in a window, so he was getting some fresh air. I'm proud of the kid for just sticking with the sermon that long, right? He was doing pretty good, but yeah, didn't work out well. Let's read this, and starting in verse 7. On the first day of the week, when we were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. And he prolonged his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the 3rd story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. Okay. So they were gathered for the first day of the week. For what purpose does it say in verse 7? For breaking bread. What does that phrase mean? Trick question, be careful. What does that phrase mean, breaking bread? More than that. Okay, yeah. So it could mean, as Mike pointed out, it can mean 2 things. It can mean taking the Lord's Supper, or it can mean just sharing a meal, right? They gathered together to break bread. They had a meal together. So it kind of
clarified in verse 11 when he says, "and ate."
And ate, yeah.
You wouldn't describe the Lord's Supper as eating.
And I looked at that too, Linda, trying to understand that word ate. And it is a different word. It means more like taste a little bit.
Yeah.
So it sounded more like what we might do for the Lord's Supper. So it's interesting that that word breaking bread. Why did people break bread in the 1st century? I always like this question. Why did people break bread? That's the way they shared it, right? Came in one piece. They baked it as a loaf. If somebody says, "Why did people break bread in the 1st century?" You can just say, "Well, because it wasn't sliced." Actually, sliced bread didn't happen until like the 40s or 50s, something like that. Very recent. That's also a good trivia question. I think it was Wholesome Bread Company that first started slicing bread, where you could buy it already sliced. But it hadn't been around that long. It certainly wasn't around back then. If you wanted to share your bread with somebody, you took a piece off the loaf and you handed it to the other person. You broke bread together. It was the sharing of the meal. Okay. So they were gathered to break bread, and we understand from this context it was to take the Lord's Supper. And that's why they were gathered together. So who was talking and what was his plans? Verse 7. Paul was talking, and what did he plan to do? He was planning to leave the next day. Very good. So that was his plan, and he prolonged his speech till, it doesn't tell us when they started. It just says it was the first day of the week. So sometime after 6 they started, but he kept talking until midnight. And they were using lamps. We talked about that. They were using lamps for their meeting so that they could see. Young man's name was Eutychus. Doesn't really tell us how old he is. He's sitting up in the 3rd-story window. There's not a whole lot, Terry, that I remember from my EMT training, but I do remember what the distance is for a trauma fall, for a major trauma. That's 15 feet. Anything more than 15 feet, right, is considered a major trauma. 3rd story. That's a long way for somebody to fall. So yeah, and it killed him. It says he was taken up dead. They picked him up. He was lifeless. He was dead. What did Paul do, and what did he say when this happened? Verse 10. Went down, took him up in his arms, bent over him, took him up in his arms, and said, "Don't be alarmed, his life is still in him." The boy came back to life. Pretty amazing. What did Paul then do? Yeah, talk about focus. So somebody's listening to your sermon, they fall from a window, they're killed, you go outside, find them dead, bring them back from the dead, and then go back up and continue your sermon. That's pretty good focus. And how long did he talk with them? Till daybreak, right? It almost feels like 12 hours, doesn't it? I mean, if you go 6 to 6, from sunset to... Yeah, well, we'll talk about that. Yeah, but it is interesting, isn't it? He talked for a long time. And I love the way that verse 12 ends with a statement in the negative. They weren't a little bit comforted. In other words, they were thrilled that this boy was still alive. Very excited. Okay, and they were all encouraged by this event. We talked about what breaking bread means. There's a couple places that I want us to notice to kind of help us understand that it doesn't just mean sharing bread. Let's go to Acts chapter 2 real quick. This is a handy place because it mentions both occurrences, both uses of this phrase. Verse 42, let's look at that. So this is the fellowship of the believers after the start of the church, verse 42, and they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. So how do you think the word breaking of bread is used there? What's it referring to? Sounds like the Lord's Supper, doesn't it? So this is something that they're observing, that they're doing on a regular basis. So let's go on down to verse 46. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. How is breaking bread used here when it says they're breaking bread in each other's homes and enjoying, and they're sharing meals together, right? They're sharing meals together. And besides, it says day by day, as Dr. Manor reminded us, this is the Lord's Supper, something we do on the first day of the week. This says day by day, on a regular basis, they were meeting in each other's homes, sharing meals together, and with glad and sincere hearts. Let's go to Acts 27. This is a spoiler alert. Let's go to verse 33 real quick. So this is when Paul's on his way. He's sailing back to Jerusalem, to Rome. Sorry, he's sailing to Rome. He said, I appeal to Caesar. He's sailing to Rome. He's on this ship. They get caught up north of Africa in this incredible storm that goes on forever, it seems like, days and days and days. Let's pick it up in verse 33. As day was about to dawn, Paul urged them to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have continued in suspense and without food, having taken nothing. Therefore I urge you to take some food, for it will give you strength, and not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And when he had said these things, he took bread, and giving thanks to God in the presence of all, he broke it and began to eat. Then they all were encouraged and ate some food themselves. We were in all 276 persons in the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship, throwing out the wheat into the sea. Well, another example of people breaking bread for a meal, not for the Lord's Supper. So we need to understand what that term is and what it means to break bread. We also talked about that when we went through the Gospels and we looked at John 19. What does John 19 say about Jesus' body? Well, John 6 says it was bread of life. Yeah. Says he's the manna from heaven. Yeah. What does John 19 at the crucifixion, what does it say about Jesus' body? And John was standing there. It was pierced. Was it broken?
No. Well, yeah, in a way.
So no bones were broken. So if we say that the bread represents the broken body of our Lord, that doesn't agree with what the Bible teaches, right? John 19 says he was not broken. In fact, John wrote it. He said, I'm a witness. And he also said this fulfills prophecy that we see in 2 Old Testament places, that he would not be broken. And if we look at, when I studied this, I looked at it even further. I looked up every occurrence of the word break or broke or broken in the New Testament. And never once does the Bible describe Jesus' body as being broken. But it's a phrase that we've kind of come to use. We just need to remember, and it was interesting, I was talking with somebody about this, and they said, and they were, I won't mention, they were from another country. And they said they never heard this notion of Jesus' body being broken until they came to the United States. In the country where they worship and where they study, everybody understood that Jesus' body was not broken because that's what John 19 tells us. But for some reason in the United States, it's kind of become a custom for us to believe that and to say this bread represents the broken body of our Lord. Won't find it. Won't find it. So, they were there to break bread. They celebrated the breaking of bread. This is an interesting thing. So we looked at the reckoning of Jewish time. What day of the week did they take the Lord's Supper? Here. He preached till midnight, right? So from our time, what day was it? If it get past midnight? It was Sunday, our time. It was the same day for them, right? Because the day started at sunset. So he preached till midnight, and they took the bread, what would have been early Sunday morning for us. So yeah, they took it on the first day of the week. I wanted to include this. Somebody brought this up. What's the authorized length of a sermon? 12 hours, right?
Not so long that everybody can't get to the restaurant by noon.
Yeah.
Before the Baptist chapter.
I guess you can preach as long as you want, as long as you can raise the sleepy people from the dead, right? Yeah. Well, it'd be a long time. At least if you fall asleep here, you won't be falling out a window. But yeah, that was an interesting case. Clearly, Paul was fired up and into it, and the people were listening, and they were having a very good time of learning and encouragement together that went on for hours. Would have loved to have heard that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Verse 11 talks about really conversed with them when they read. So you kind of get the idea that at this point there was like
Yeah.
back and forth questions and he was answering. And he didn't know when he was going to see him again. He's leaving the next day.
Yeah.
He's got stuff to say. He's going to say it. They have questions probably.
He kind of knows the time's close and with his life. And we'll see this as we go through the next section of the book and we see him talking with the Ephesian elders. He kind of knows what's ahead for him. And yeah, he feels concerned. He wants to share some things. It feels more like a Bible class, doesn't it? Okay, how are we doing on time? Got a minute and a half. Any other thoughts on this? This is probably a good stopping place.
You know, Jeff, in 1 Corinthians 11, where Jesus institutes the Lord's Supper, I think is where we get this idea of the broken, Jesus' body.
Yeah,
That phrase, it's broken, because I know we've always said that.
yeah,
But for the longest time, that's kind of bothered me too, because it's clear that his bones were not broken. And people say, well, you know, there was mental, there was psychological, there was
Yeah.
all kinds of ways you can be broken. But when he says he took the bread, he gave thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. You make the mistake of putting the broken on the body instead of the
Yes.
broken on the bread.
yes,
The bread is what's broken, not the
The bread is what's broken.
That phrase is about
Yeah.
the bread that he's breaking, not about the body that is broken, because that
Yeah.
doesn't happen. But I think that's probably where.
Oh, I know it's exactly where it came at.
But
Yeah,
it's a lesson to us to study carefully, keep our minds open, to let
Oops.
the Word speak and not tradition speak.
yes,
And I think that's a good lesson for anybody, no matter what faith you follow, or not what religion you follow, I guess. Read it. What does it say? Not what somebody told you it said.
Not
or
what somebody told
somebody's
you,
always
yeah.
said, and some phrase that's always been listed. What does it say? And
Yeah.
try to keep your mind open
Yeah.
to what it says.
yeah. A lot of times I'll have this discussion with someone. They'll say, well, his skin was broken, or, well, then we're trying to figure out a way to
Make it fit.
make it fit what we believe rather than looking at what the Word says. And the Bible makes it really clear he was not broken. And he never describes our Lord as being broken emotionally. Oh, I can't take it anymore. He wasn't broken emotionally.
Trying to make it fit.
He set his sight on the cross. Yes.
Acts 20 and 7 and Acts 2:42 are the first communion on the first day of the week, and we did it continuously.
Yeah.
For our examples to do it the first day of every week.
First day of every week.
Groups don't do it every week.
Yeah, and I really like the way Dale Manor brought that home. It was the day the church was started. It was the day the Lord was raised from the dead. We've got good cause, good reason, and good example for taking the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. Good. Thank you all for your comments. We'll just pick it up here next week.